All right, it's close to 3 minutes after. Shall we get started? Thanks for joining us today, everyone. We're super excited. I'm super excited to have this all-star lineup with us to talk about what's been happening most recently in the Russo-Ukrainian, conflict. And the plan for this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, is to just quickly introduce the esteemed panelists. And then we'll swing into some questions, and we do invite you to pose questions through the Q&A function. I see a lot of familiar names in the audience, and so I think this is going to be a lively conversation. And we do hope you will participate. So I think everybody knows that this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, we wanted to have a conversation about the perceived lack of cyber operations being used in the early part of the conflict. But we in fact do know that offensive cyber campaigns have been key components of the ongoing conflict. And it's important to think about and kind of how those have played out, the purposes to which they've been used, what the international community's reaction to those have been, and kind of what this tells us for the future. So this afternoon, I'm delighted to be joined by Erica Lonergan, Silas Cutler, and Marc Rogers, and I will turn it over to them to introduce themselves, and I will ask Erica to please go first.
Great, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm Erica Lonergan. I'm a professor at the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. I'm also a research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of Foreign Peace Studies at Columbia University. And just quick disclaimer, the views I'm expressing today are mine alone and certainly not that of the US government. So thank you and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Erica. I guess we'll follow alphabetical order, so that would put Marc next.
Hi, I'm also delighted to be here. Marc Rogers. I'm in charge of cybersecurity strategy at Okta, but wear many hats. I'm also the head of security at DEF CON, founder of the CTI League, and a white hat security researcher in my own right.
And certainly, last but not least, Silas.
Hi, I'm Silas Cutler. I'm a security researcher at Stairwell. My focus is on malware analysis, and I've been tracking hostile cyber operations against Ukraine for probably the better part of like 5 or 6 years at least now.
So as you've just heard, we have quite the panel with us today. So we'll quickly jump into questions for those of you who just came on board. You're welcome to post questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I guess I should have introduced myself. My name is Megan Stifel. I currently serve as the Chief Strategy Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology, and have been working on cyber policy issues, both defensive and offensive, for too long to catalog, but over a decade. So here we go. So, and we didn't actually sort of decide who would go first on these. So if one of you gets too quick to the answer button, I will intervene. But as it became clear that Russia might wage war in Ukraine, I'm curious, because you serve in kind of different capacities and different functions, and you may examine these issues from different perspectives, what each of you was looking for on the sort of ICT, or information and communications technology / cyber front. And because I will follow the ladies first, even though I guess maybe that's antiquated, I'll ask Erica to go first.
Sure. Yeah, I'll happy to jump in. So yeah, I mean, so I think that, so I'm coming at this from a political science perspective. That's what my background is in, and my expertise in international security. So I'm curious to hear what my colleagues on the panel think. But I sort of take the perspective of like military campaigning, right? So when you're talking about the time sort of in the lead up to the invasion, if you put sort of a US military perspective on it, right, it's like phase 0 or phase 1 of the campaign. Obviously that's a US construct, but I think there's sort of a general logic that applies regardless of who's doing the actual campaigning. So for me, what I was looking for was, what types of cyber activities might Russia be doing to kind of prepare the battlefield and shape the environment for a forthcoming invasion. So I think that, the first thing that I was looking for was information operations, which is not sort of a pure cyber operation, but obviously cyberspace can enable information operations to help shape the information environment, not just in Ukraine, but also internationally, right? So Russia is the initiating state. They have a narrative that they want to promote to justify their invasion, both with their own audiences, with Ukrainian audiences, with broader audiences. And so, obviously their justification is false, right? That the Ukrainian government is corrupt and run by Nazis, but they still have an interest in kind of, shaping the environment to undermine sort of cohesion within NATO and the United States, to potentially thwart, a united NATO response, to sort of shape the environment in Ukraine, to shape international perception. And so there's this information component first. The second thing that I was sort of looking for was the use of cyber operations sort of as a shaping tool to, in advance of kinetic military operations, to do things like disrupting Ukrainian command and control and critical military infrastructure. And so the purpose there would be to try to deny Ukraine's ability to communicate with its forces and its population, deny their ability to mount an effective military defense, and so on. And then I think sort of the last thing that I was looking for was sort of cyber attacks against civilian critical infrastructure, maybe not sort of in the lead up to the invasion, but perhaps in the early stages of it, similar to what we saw in 2015 with the attack on the power grid. And that, in my mind, would serve an objective of undermining the Ukrainian people's perception of the credibility of its government.
Thanks, Erica. So certainly it sounds like kind of the full suite of things when we capabilities or uses when we envision how we ourselves, in fact, might use these capabilities. Silas or Marc, who?
Yeah. So to second Erica's point, especially with the shaping technique. So I drew a lot of inspiration from Jason Healy in the early days of the conflict, especially in preparing for what a lot of folks know is like a sort of a cyber surprise, in which we would see that sort of shaping occur and through a disruption of a communication system or other large impactful target. And we saw a little bit of this potentially with the early attacks against the financial sector in Ukraine, targeting in an attempt to undermine that confidence in the financial system, especially people aren't getting paid.
So I agree with what both my co-panelists have said. The only thing I think that's a little bit challenging is that it's quite hard to separate campaigns. And as some would phrase it, the gray zone or sort of nonlinear warfare that occurs between different campaigns. And I think there's a lot of that going on. So while they're absolutely, tracking disinformation is something that I've been doing for a while. We were doing it in the CTI League, looking at disinformation against hospitals, against the election, and obviously, looking for the same techniques being used in this. But there's this constant background of it, and I think Russia got itself into a position where this became a main asset. But I don't know that it was such a cohesive tool as that we're going to do this and then we're going to do kinetic things. There absolutely were distinct events, like as said before, when they specifically struck out at the communications command and control infrastructure. That, I think, was one of the things that very clearly linked in to kinetic effects, and you saw, immediate action. But a lot of the other stuff has just been sort of rolling. I think there's been nearly 300 distinct cyber attacks over the whole war period. But if you distill that down to how many of them actually tie into actual kinetic activities, I think it's less than 10. And it's looking for those less than 10 that are sort of the indicators that are things that are going on. So for me, the thing I was looking for was a big ramp up in the narrative, which was this whole, the Ukrainian government is Nazis and we must do something about it side of things, and the attacks against the communications infrastructure that sort of heralded something big was about to come. And there was a definite ramp up that you could see at that point.
Silas, go ahead. Yeah.
So one of the things I think has also been really interesting in it, and it's something I've kind of loosely started referring to as the Dr. Daniel Moore principle of, if you don't have good cohesion between your kinetic actions and your cyber actions, the cyber will consistently be an unreliable factor. And I think as well, even though like there have been numbers like 300 different cyber attacks, it doesn't differentiate enough of which cyber attacks, because a DDoS attack could fall into that category as well. But a DDoS attack has short depth usually of how far it's going, whereas if an attack is stopped, a phishing message is caught, which the final intention is then to say conduct drop in destroyer or something, or one of these other critical infrastructure pieces of malware, like those get lumped into the same category, and it's hard to separate out which ones were meant as larger offensives that failed versus which ones were just short-term opportunistic attacks.
Can I just jump in briefly on one point? I mean, I agree with what everyone is saying, and I think that I don't think we have a use case of good examples either in Ukraine or in previous instances, though there are a few, right? But you could look at Nadia Kostyuk has done work on looking at the coordination of cyber and kinetic military action in Syria and in Crimea in 2014. We haven't seen states or militaries be able to demonstrate that they can effectively coordinate cyber effects and kinetic effects in any useful and meaningful way. And so I do think this raises big questions about, is this because of something about how militaries are currently organized and resourced? Is it something about cyber? I don't think we know yet. And it's probably because we don't have a lot of good cases to look at.
And I think that there's also another point, which is that cyber isn't decisive.
Yep.
You can do stuff with cyber, you can amplify things with cyber, but unlike other modes of attack, like domains like the air, the sea, the land, you can't make a decisive offensive that will then give you control through cyber. At most, you can influence something for a defined period of time, which you then maybe can tie into something else to become a force multiplier. And I think the world's military is really still grappling with that, trying to understand where does it fit in and how do we use it? Is it a capability? Is it an intelligence package? Is it, what's really interesting for me out of the whole Ukraine-Russia war is actually what is happening with the influx of private sector talent and capability into the Ukrainian defensive strategy and how agile they're becoming. That agility is allowing them to leverage things in ways that I don't think any traditional military has been able to do before.
So I want to turn to this question, but before we get into this question, or sort of as a segue to this question, up until Marc's intervention, I didn't hear, no, it's a good one. I heard a lot about Russia, but I didn't hear much about Ukraine. And sort of so we sort of had the sense, and we know, Silas mentioned that he's been tracking some of this for a number of years, some of this meaning OP, OPB, operational preparation of the environment or the battlefield. How about defensive measures from the side of Ukraine before they proceeded to potentially kind of call up reservists, if you will? Did any of you expect to see more kind of overt, whether it be technical or kind of on the diplomatic side of things, kind of preparatory actions from the Ukrainian side, or was it as expected, or you weren't looking for it, which is also fine? We kind of think about Russia here a lot, but.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen, we haven't gotten a lot of details, which isn't surprising, but I think there's been a lot of public conversation about defensive measures in anticipation of Russia's invasion. You saw General Nakasone, commander of US Cyber Command, testifying about it, about how, Cyber Command and presumably other partners as well have been providing defensive support to Ukraine well before the invasion on February 24th. And from what I've seen, there were lessons learned after 2015, especially to try to improve for Ukraine to articulate a cyber strategy to improve resilience of critical infrastructure, and so it's hard to know. I think for me, like the unanswered question is how much of the lack of decisiveness of cyber in this conflict is due to things that are the inherent limitations of cyberspace in wartime, is due to sort of effective, defense and resilience by Ukraine in coordination with not just governments, but also private sector partners or participants, is due to Russian sort of incompetence writ large in this conflict, not just in cyber, but in kinetic domains, some combination of these. Like, I think those are it's hard to weigh that right now, but those are the unanswered questions that I'm thinking about.
I agree, and I'd throw another one into the mix, and that is we sometimes, I think, forget just how close Ukraine is to Russia. And so a lot of the activities have crossover. So a lot of the cyber criminal activity has been joint Russian and Ukrainian, or whole regional kind of participation. And so I think the Ukrainians are a lot more familiar with Russian tactics than the Russians would probably like. But conversely, I think the Russians are a lot more familiar with Ukrainian tactics than the Ukrainians would probably like. So I think I saw a distinct ramp up in terms of support to Ukraine, and I think it was good, but I don't think it was ever going to be really massively impactful, because I think actually the Russians are way more opportunistic than people think. Like, everyone thinks of them as this sort of laser-focused, zero-day wielding giant that comes in and takes whatever they're after, whereas I think they're much more, we'll grab what we can over a period of time and then build a really cohesive operation around it and then do something. But the problem with that is it means a lot of their campaigns have to be way planned farther out. And once they're spent, they're spent. And so you're not going to see a whole raft of really new clever stuff unless they're keeping it under their sleeves, which honestly, given the way the war's going, I don't think they probably are. So yeah, I think it was really heartening for me to see the international support coming in and the bolstering of Ukraine's defenses, especially a number of critical civilian infrastructure sites, communications, medical, power, etc. And I hope this kind of sets a tone for the way things move in the future. But I think, as my colleague just said, it's going to be when we're picking the pieces up later on that we really sort of understand what was massively impactful, what wasn't, and why.
Go ahead, Silas.
I think in addition to that as well is, and I know this was one of the things that I thought a lot about during the early parts of the conflict, was if Russia's true intention was full control over Ukraine and Ukraine becoming a province and a state of greater Russia, destroying and causing permanent damage to a significant number of pieces of critical infrastructure, communication infrastructure, the onus to repair those and replace those then falls on, now it would be Russia as well. So I wonder as well if there was an element of restraint that went into things to avoid causing increased damages that would later be on them to repair and replace.
Anyone have a reaction to that?
I have to admit, I'm kind of skeptical. Yeah. I honestly, I think their approaches to these things are a lot more simplistic. I mean, you compare the kinetic side of things to, like, Russia hasn't been in a lot of land wars, and they've got quite an aging equipment set, and they were forced to grab quite a lot of really green recruits when they started this campaign. All of that sort of doesn't really point to something that was really well thought through, or that had this kind of deliberate sort of, we want to do this as gentle as possible. I think they probably did think that they were going to just march in, surround Kiev, and that would be it. And then when it happened, when that didn't happen, they just resorted to smashing everything in their way. I'm skeptical about the restraint side of it.
That's totally fair.
Erica, any comments?
Yeah, I'm skeptical of the, sorry.
Oh, please, yeah.
Pile on. No, I'm skeptical of the restraint argument too. But I also think we have to remember that we're kind of deriving the most insight we can from what we're observing, based on what's being reported. It's really hard to penetrate the decision-making of a state like Russia, particularly Russia, now after, Putin's been isolated for all this time and surrounded by yes men, and probably has a very warped, we don't quite know what his perspective on things are and what factored into his decision making. So again, I'm skeptical, but I'm aware of the limitations of the information we have and what we can learn from it at this point.
Just to build a little bit on sort of a two-part question, or maybe there are two separate questions on kind of our awareness of what's gone into the narrative, or not even the narrative, the factors that have contributed to the narrative that cyber hasn't been the big thing in this conflict. Two bits. One is kind of, Marc, to the question that you started, or sort of the observation you made a couple of minutes ago about, I called it the call up of reserves, even though they're technically not reserves under probably the Geneva Convention or all the other laws of war, perhaps, and that I think would be an interesting panel, but we'll get to that one maybe in a future month, because I do think that this kind of can potentially, well, anyways, how are you all reacting to this call that was made, and aside from kind of the volunteer armies, Microsoft, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, put out a report that identified, I think in part, Marc, some of the number that you made, which was kind of the large number of purported attacks. And so how do we, the second phase of this question is, in addition to the kind of volunteer defensive measures, would you like to see, perhaps it sounds like a loaded question or like an unfair question, I found that Microsoft report to be useful to the overall dialogue, in addition to having some of the technical information that it included. And I would like to see kind of similar descriptions from some of the other major cloud providers and software providers in this space. So thinking in particular about some of the other ones that are housed in the United States, like Google and AWS. Would that be of interest to all of you? So first we'll take the volunteer army question, and how you saw that. Did you expect it? How do you think it went? And how do you think it changes the dynamics of cyber conflict going forward?
Well, I can jump in on that question, certainly. And by volunteer army, I think I just wanted to clarify, you're referring to sort of Ukraine's IT army, right? Okay. Yeah, so that was surprising to me. That was, I think, the one thing that I was quite taken aback by. Not the idea that a state would rely on, the hacktivists and proxies and whatever to conduct operations on its behalf in cyberspace, but because we see that all the time, right? That's part of the Russian playbook, certainly. But what we don't see is states being so open about it and giving targeting lists on Telegram. Like, that is, I could not have expected that. And because, usually when we talk about cyber proxies, when I say we, I mean political scientists, right? So again, like, perhaps it's less surprising to technologists and threat intel analysts and so on. But cyber proxies are oftentimes beneficial because of plausible deniability. And, Russia constantly denies its, use of, reliance on these groups for, for cyber operations. And so, the fact that the government in Ukraine was so public, unapologetically public about it, and seemingly indiscriminate in who it was willing to have, volunteer to be part of its IT army. I think that's really interesting. And I wrote about this when the news came out about it. I think that, to me, I'm concerned about what that means for, norms that we try to promote about state sponsorship of non-state actors in cyberspace, and how you think about the implications for what is acceptable targeting and by whom and under what conditions, and what does this mean for state responsibility? Because this isn't typically behavior that states like the United States like to condone, but we're in this uncomfortable position where we support the Ukrainian government, and our political objectives are aligned with theirs. But this, I think, raises some questions. And, obviously, plausible deniability means less in a war when the conflict is actually happening, but you still see Russia denying what it's doing in cyberspace when it's called out. So yeah, I think this took me by surprise, and I think I'm curious to see how it unfolds.
So it didn't really take me by surprise at all. I thought it was a genius move optically. It allowed them to perpetuate the narrative and get a lot of people engaged in their war, which has bolstered support in a lot of other areas. Whether or not it's paid off effectively, I think is open for debate. Like if you look at the list of acquisitions, things that the IT army has been successful in accomplishing, there are some, pretty effective things, but the reality is, they're like Anonymous, and it's basically an army of monkeys. Doesn't mean to say it's not good to have an army of monkeys on your side, but it's never going to be a massively decisive thing. If you compare their operations, for example, to like the Belarusian cyber partisans, they, on the other hand, have been phenomenally effective. Like the list of campaigns that they've been involved in and accomplishments they've made is ever growing, and it's because they're a small, tight group with really good OPSEC, some highly talented people in it, supported by some relatively talented people. I think it all speaks to the private sector coming into these campaigns and changing it. And for me, this is going to be the biggest sort of evolution out of this. By taking private sector practices and putting them into how you conduct campaigns, you completely transform things. How many militaries could project their force to the extent that the Ukrainian force can currently, with the support that it's getting from folks like the IT army and other groups that are affiliated with it, and groups like the Belarusian cyber partisans who are working to their own agenda, but that agenda supports what the Ukrainians want anyway. For me, I think this was kind of an inevitable evolution. Like these groups being looking for a quest, a thing to do, something that justifies their existence and a way to participate. I mean, here we are armchair quarterbacking all of this, and for them, this is like the next level. They can actually get engaged and be part of it. I do think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens later, because, the rules of war have changed, and strictly speaking, it is acceptable to use kinetic responses to people who are engaging in cyber activities in regions of conflict. I don't think we're likely to see people being blown up in the US, but on the other hand, some folks who are participating in this stuff in bordering countries might want to be a little bit careful about some of the stuff they do. And And then what happens afterwards? Now you've got all these sort of amateur soldiers who have redefined what the front line looks like and made it into much more of a porous thing, much like the perimeter of security in a corporation. Like everything is porous now and everything's distributed. What's that going to mean for us down the line? And yeah, not surprising, but really, really interesting.
I believe also Russia has actually classified the volunteers that are joining the Ukrainian IT army as well as mercenaries. And I'm very curious to know as well, like what that means in terms of sort of foreign policy and how they're classified as well. Because they're not given the same protections as well as like lawful combatants. So it definitely changed the dynamic. Similar to Marc, I feel like I expected there was going to be some type of hacktivist response to the event. However, I definitely did not expect that it was going to be as sanctioned and organized. And it also is definitely worth noting the Belarusian cyber partisans also not only have managed to like definitively like push some of their objectives forward, but they've also been able to execute on them within very short timeframes as well, such as the disruption of the Belarusian railway during the early part of the conflict. Like those, it emphasizes the key differences as well when you have large groups operating under loose control versus a organized and planned group, and very similar to having some of those private sector style organized processes like as part of their operations.
And just sort of Dave in the chat, maybe the ones we're hearing about are essentially the monkeys, and I think that's 100% right, because I think the groups that are being most effective are the ones that have super tight OPSEC, and they understand OPSEC in a way that only people who are really familiar with the internet can understand. And I think that's why they're always going to be ahead of the game when it comes to some of these tactics and techniques.
So we've already passed the halfway point, and we haven't even sort of gotten into the technical, if you will, bits of this conversation. So I do want to talk a little bit about some of the tactics and some of the cyber operations that we have seen, and thinking about a couple of things. One is sort of the thinking about the ransomware gangs. So I think most folks know that IST last year convened the ransomware task force. So of course, this is something that we eat, sleep, and breathe still every day, and can't miss an opportunity to ask questions about. What have you all seen? And in fact, today, Rob Joyce, or maybe it was yesterday, at is it Cyber UK? UK Cyber, I might have it wrong, asserted that they've seen a decline in ransomware incidents over the past couple of months, and sort of associates that with the ongoing conflict, but also leaves room for there to be other reasons for that. But how did you all see the ransomware actors leading up to the invasion? And it seems like there could be some quibbling, and so do you all sense that this potential decline, although I'd love to see the evidence for that, is here to stay, or will they resume if things kind of continue on their current trajectory, which is to say that the conflict doesn't conclude, it just continues to kind of be this steady state?
I mean, well, we've definitely seen the infighting, and I think the Conti leak is kind of the biggest thing of that. And that's something I think we're going to be picking through that for years to come, just because of all of the little things that we keep learning that come out of it. I'm not quite sure where the future goes with it, though. I think there's definitely been a rift in some of the ransomware communities as a result of it. I think a lot of them are also worried about being massively exposed, kind of like how Conti was. Yeah.
I think if there's one thing we know about ransomware, and that is they are really good at reinventing themselves. You squash one group and you'll get another bunch of groups that spin off of it. I think we've also underestimated just how regional some of this is. Like, there's too much focus on specific groups and not enough focus, I think, on the fact that this is an entire ecosystem. And so I think what you'll see, like, I don't want to disagree completely with Rob, right? He's obviously got the stats and I don't. But I think that there are ransomware groups out there that are loving this because chaos is financially lucrative. But on the flip side, the chaos is also problematic because the sanctions are going to obviously be getting in the way of them. It's hard to make money if you can't cash out. And so I think there's going to be like it's just chaos right now. But I don't think it's going to have a lasting impact on ransomware. I think that's going to take a concerted effort from all parties actually attacking ransomware to do something about it. But it is going to reshape some things. And, maybe this is why we're seeing some of the more simplistic ransomware attacks, like simple file extortion type attacks on the rise. Because, anyone can at least do that sort of stuff. And you don't need the larger platforms or sophisticated code in order to execute on those.
Yeah, I mean, not to be repetitive, but I think that when it comes to ransomware, as you all know, right? Like, at the end of the day, we're talking about financially motivated actors, not typically ideologically or politically motivated ones. And so there are, lots of reasons why, I take it at face value if Rob Joyce says that it's declined, that it's declined, right? So if we accept that that's accurate, then it makes sense. There are lots of factors why we might expect it to have, I would say, be on a hiatus or a pause, but I don't think this means that there will be some sort of that this is heralding, radical decline in ransomware. I also think, and this is pure speculation on my part, and I'm curious to hear what my other panelists think, but specifically when it comes to some of the more like targeted and strategic ransomware attacks, my understanding is that, the more sophisticated groups have, information about things like, anticipated insurance payouts and things like that, which I imagine would be less likely to take, insurance companies are not going to pay out in times of war. This is a time of war. So, the sort of the more sophisticated and ransomware attacks, I imagine, might just simply be less likely to net financial gain for these groups. But that's pure speculation on my part, and I have no idea if I'm barking up the wrong tree on that one.
So I know that there's definitely ransomware groups that will put their ransom demand amount at what they believe that the defender can pay. If they have an idea, and I suspect they have a rough idea at least of what the payouts will be and what insurance companies will cover. And I don't think just because we're in the midst of a conflict, the insurance companies will not pay out. I think for the case that everybody kind of goes back to a lot of times with an insurance payout not occurring was, I cannot remember, Maersk, the shipping company, where they had a significant amount of damage incurred from NotPetya, and it was not paid out by insurance, I believe, because it was classified as war related and not necessarily true ransomware. There's a lot of factors that could be driving down it. I know there was a story from a few months ago about Russia not being able to purchase hard drives anymore and a massive ability to store data challenge that they were facing. So it's entirely possible that some of those factors could be playing into it as well. It could be spring. They could also be, taking vacations.
Visiting the Black Sea might be a little bit dicey these days, though. But we do like it when they travel.
Hard to get used to these days, apparently.
Marc, did you want to come in on the ransomware bit any further, or?
No, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I'm interested to see how things evolve, and if this does force groups to move, as you said, we do love it when they move.
Yes. So, okay, ransomware. How about thinking about sort of the use of DDoS, and of course we can't not mention, and I'd love to spend a couple seconds talking about the and there's been a question in the audience about very small aperture targeting and the impact that that had. And so weighing in on kind of the use of distributed denial of service attacks as one tool that's been deployed here. They seem to have been kind of unsophisticated. Would you all agree with that? And if that's the case, what do we think about why they deployed or used them? Does it seem like it's sort of consistent with prior approaches and sort of, I guess, clumsy or plotting at best? Or how do you all view that?
So by and large, DDoS is rarely sophisticated in its techniques. There are definitely times in which there's incredibly clever sophistication that occurs, mainly in terms of like targeting and sometimes in the techniques. But one of the things that I think has been kind of blurring a little bit when it comes to the DDoS as well is there are definitely, for lack of a better definition, script kiddies that are trying to take advantage of the situation by saying, everybody saw the news story of like our big attack. This is why you should pay us for your, stress testing services. So there's a little bit of that I think has also gotten blurred into the conflict. And it's entirely possible also some like hostile governments are trying to use the same type of services in order as, cover for action as well.
I think there's also there's the barrier to entry equation in this. If you look at all the cyber attacks that are on the menu that some nation state or group could carry out, DDoS is like right at the bottom. You can rent a server or rent a service and go and launch some attacks. How effective it is, they can be pretty effective if a whole bunch of them happens. And we know that there's a history of this happening. If you go as far back, say, as the Russian-Georgia war, there were significant DDoSes against critical pieces of infrastructure, against financial institutions, broadcast facilities, etc. They weren't necessarily attributed to Russia at the time. They were sort of Russian-affiliated groups, I think. But it's, there's a pattern there of people want to get involved, and this is the easiest way to get involved. The one sort of thing I would throw into the mix is when we're talking about denial of service, we should probably also throw in RF type denial of services, because one of the things I think Russia has made very good use of, and I suspect because it is quite a traditional action that a lot of military commanders understand, is using RF and jamming type capabilities to disrupt civilian communications as well as command and control for military communications. They even, we know, went after Starlink when Ukraine started pivoting to using Starlink as a backup communications channel. I think that use of denial of service has been very effective, although I think in some cases it's backfired a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add. I would just say that, I've been following this pretty closely, but I haven't seen a lot of reporting on any major DDoS attacks after like the first week or so of the conflict on the Russian side. Maybe I missed something, which is certainly possible, but anything that I had seen had been sort of in the lead up to and in the initial stage of the invasion, where you saw denial of service attacks against government, financial sector, along with a bunch of other things that were going on in cyberspace in the initial phases, like the wiper attacks, and that's kind of if you look, you referenced the Microsoft report earlier. If you look at the Microsoft report that was tracking Russian cyber activity, it really tapered all kind of universally. Seemed to taper off after the first week of the invasion, which to me shows how these kinds of disruptive operations that have temporary tactical effects, could be used to try to shape the environment in the initial phase of a campaign, but aren't, as we've been talking about all, afternoon / morning, depending on where you are, aren't really decisive when the bullets start flying and you're actually in the throes of a conventional conflict. And so I see the DDoS activity as being consistent with the other types of cyber activity that we've seen, especially when we think about the timing of it too.
I agree. I think it also ties into what I said before about like the different planning approaches. Like Russia's is a very traditional sort of strategy from the top, goes down all the way to the people who do things, and things get planned long out. And whereas on the Ukraine side and in other spaces, it's much more agile and reactive. The problem with the long-term planning one is, you get all your ducks lined in a row. Once all your dominoes stacked, rather, would be a better analogy. Once you've knocked the dominoes over, it takes time to set up another line of dominoes before you can knock them over again. And that's when I think the value prospect of it kicks in. It's like, why stack up another bunch of dominoes if it's not going to have, that much of an impact on the campaign? Whereas if you move to a much more agile, sort of fluid approach and do just like thing, I think the effect is a lot more impactful.
Megan, you're muted.
This is happening to me more and more. In the beginning of this whole pandemic, I was like, what's with these people? Why can't they find the mute button? Now, tables have turned. I deserve it. So I was starting to say that I'm watching the time and also looking at the chat. And so there was a question which keeps escaping when I try and scroll up about, so Mike Nelson from, I guess I will attribute him to Carnegie. I don't know if he wants to be. So if that's the case, then disregard that attribution, just because it could be just his own question. Talks about, so we were just speaking about Russian attacks on but what about the inverse or the converse, which is kind of this, among other powerful parts of the information warfare campaign, the use of cell phone conversations between Russian soldiers and their families back home. Mike's question was, how could Russians be so flawed and lack discipline, essentially? But is there the possibility that the Ukrainians and allies, were specifically targeting this infrastructure in part to help the information war?
So yes to both. I think honestly, Russia's on the ground OPSEC is terrible. They have for years been trying to stop their soldiers from taking selfies and posting them. And there are ELINT groups that have sprung up that are, just pumping intelligence out as a result of the metadata and other information that they're pulling from these images and things. Russia even passed a law recently to say that it's, troops aren't allowed to do this. But they still do. I mean, I will caveat that by saying, we've had our own problems in the US with troops and jogging applications and things, but Russia seems to be particularly bad at it, and the Ukrainians are taking significant advantage of it. And I hesitate to say game changer, but I think it's going to come out and be seen as a major factor in this war, the targeting and intelligence gathering capability of poorly secured devices. And when you combine that with a green force of press-ganged, low morale people who are calling home, it only gets worse. I don't know if everyone has seen the website 200rf.com. Sort of a little bit questionable whether this is an ethical approach that Ukraine's taken. Personally, I think it's great. It's essentially a website that says find your own, and it provides a cell phone number that people can call to find out whether or not Russian troops have been captured or killed in the conflict. And it's a really direct way of reaching out and touching people. And for a little bit of background, the 200RF comes from the Russian cargo plane code for the cargo planes that used to carry corpses out of Afghanistan. So it's a very on the nose kind of approach. But this direct interaction is going to be a really interesting and defining element of this war, I think.
I'm not seeing either of you jump in on that. So I'm going to take the question back to, again, to try to be responsive to questions in the audience, to the use of, Erica mentioned the use of wiperware and the like. So the question that one of our participants I had posed was, if you all had a crystal ball, do you expect to see more destructive or DDoS attacks, a mix, or both?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but if I did, I don't know. I've seen some commentary about how, that we haven't seen the cyber war yet, but we will see it soon in this conflict. And that's not to say that, again, the whole point of this panel is that there has been lots of cyber activity, but I'm skeptical that we're going to see some major ramping up of Russian destructive malware or DDoS attacks or what have you. And that's because, why? What is how would that be in furtherance of military objectives on the ground? Again, I think cyber has the most utility in phase 0 and 1. I think its utility declines precipitously over time, because once you are you've crossed the Rubicon into actual war, where war is, and I think we forget about this sometimes, because we talk, sometimes we have these sanitized conversations about conflict, but war is fundamentally about violence. It's about killing people and breaking things, and it's horrific. But that's what it is. And so I don't see a real strategic utility for cyber in that. That said, again, I don't think that means that cyber isn't useful for intelligence purposes, to enable kinetic activity on the ground in some cases, to shape perception and so on and so forth. But I don't see it as a sort of war fighting capability, and so I don't expect that as the war continues we would see more of it. But I'm sure others disagree with me. So
I shook my magic 8 ball this morning, and it first said Outlook hazy, and then it said no. And I took that to mean as, we can't rule out the fact that the Russians will opportunistically find something that gives them either great intelligence benefit or, is just some crazily exposed system that they can go after. But I think it's unlikely, because I think, as said before, they would have used it already if they had, and I can't see it really ramping up massively. And the other thing is, indicators out there now, we've just seen an F5 vulnerability drop. That's probably one of the simplest vulnerabilities I've seen in the world, because someone decided to connect a web server running as root to a shell that you can just connect to and run any arbitrary command. And yet we're not seeing any of that kind of stuff being exploited. And that sort of tells me the focus isn't on grabbing these things and going after the stuff right now.
I think there was also a push probably towards the very beginning in that sort of, phase 1 of the conflict as well, that required them bringing in some of the tools they hadn't necessarily planned for or intended to, especially also with something like Hermetic Wiper, which SentinelOne has done fantastic research or coverage on. But there were indications that in it, in little political themes that were dated for 2024. So I wonder also if they've pulled some things that they had off the shelf as well to try and use them in that time when they knew there was the opportunistic, the time window in order to effectively utilize those things was occurring.
So I'm going to, in the last remaining couple of minutes, totally shift gears a bit and ask a question that's been posed about kind of media coverage of this conflict, and particularly around, unlike in traditional physical wars, if you will, if there is such a thing, where we have journalists on the ground and primary source data. We've talked a little bit about some of the private sector reporting, particularly the Microsoft report. But how would you all, how do we see this? How do we see kind of the fourth estate operating in conflicts like this one, where perhaps, I'm not saying, I'm just positing, or that because we haven't seen the sort of flashbangy cyber war that so many thought we would, that the kind of media coverage of that and sort of the lack of opportunity or insight into some of what you all, some of at least of you see in your daily lives, contributes to the, or doesn't contribute to the kind of public discourse around the use of offensive cyber capabilities.
So I think we have a really high threshold for things to hit the press now, because we have literally just had several years of internet tire fire, like incident after incident after incident, and that's pushed the bar up. And in terms of nation state activities, we've had things like SolarWinds, Colonial, Hafnium. That pushes the bar for a nation state activity all the way up. And the reality is, I think, those are more the exception than the rule, especially in a fast moving conflict where everything is being thrown at the wall. And so I think a lot of stuff is going to just go unnoticed. I suspect we're not reading about all the DDoSes because they're not really that interesting reading. And, unless they hit something particularly notable, it's probably not going to break the media threshold. On the other hand, I do think the Ukrainians have played a fantastic game in keeping themselves in the press and in the narrative. Like all the different things they're doing, like, amplifying reporting on Russian losses while essentially calming any reporting on their own. All of these things have been keeping both the conflict in the narrative, which they need in order for people to stay focused on supporting them, but also in terms of winning the propaganda war.
So responses and closing remarks. Erica, you were ready to go.
Yeah, no, I guess so. Slightly different take, and I'll be brief because I know we're running short on time. And this is like a little bit of a like pet peeve of mine, not just with the reporting on Ukraine and cyber reporting on Ukraine, but in general. I see, I totally take the point that media is only reporting on, at this point, some like higher threshold level of cyber activity, particularly when it's nation state associated. But I see so much histrionics in that reporting. And I don't want to say the threat inflation, but just, this drumbeat of cyber war and conflating what are actually very distinct types of activities that we've been talking about on this panel. And I find it frustrating because it sets up false expectations for what cyber can do, which is why we end up with these straw men like, oh my gosh, where did the cyber war go? How come it didn't happen? Well, who thought it was going to be that way? If you talk to experts, I don't think anyone thought it would look like that. And so I have this kind of lingering frustration with the language that's used, and not to malign, the media, but it's been a source of frustration. So I'll end with that.
Silas?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo the same points as well. Like my tracker saw DDoS attacks this morning, just didn't rise to the level of concern. And I'm glad to see them not being reported in some of these cases, because it does further complicate things when there's the hype cycle. But I think it's also shown that cyber will not do everything, and that at the end, like, cyber is just one piece of a larger puzzle and how these things move.
I'd just like to close by saying a massive thank you to anyone and everyone who's doing something to support Ukrainian civilians during this horrendous period. It's been heartening to see the humanitarian efforts come together.
I will echo Marc's comments, and I see everybody else nodding. So I want to close and thank our great panelists, Marc Rogers, Silas Cutler, and Erica Lonergan. This video from this session will be available online on our website, if not immediately, shortly. And stay tuned for further discussions such as these. We're happy to take suggestions too. So thanks again for sharing an hour with us, especially to our panelists, but to anyone watching and participating. And thanks to the questions. We tried to get to as many as we could, but stay well. Thanks, everyone. I think